Ladies and gentlemen, thank you. It gives me a great deal of pleasure to deliver this inaugural address. I'm going to touch on a series of subjects. Actually, when Colin and Rachel invited me to come to UC, I thought they were offering me the extinguished position, but it turned out to be otherwise. So let me start, and so I'm going to walk you through a series of things that we know about the prevention of cancer. But my first slide, I would like to dedicate this lecture to Tony McMichael, who taught me everything I know about epidemiology and a lot of what I know about cancer. Tony sadly missed indeed. Let me start with just a rundown for the worldwide incidence and mortality from cancer, and just draw your attention to the important ones at the top of the list here: breast, prostate, lung, and bowel cancer, which are the major cancers in Australia. There are quite a number of other important cancers here, but you can see that these constitute the major burden around the world. Now, moving a little closer, this is looking at the distribution of the risks from 1975 to 2010 across a number of countries. You can see the clustering there between Australia, Canada, the US, and New Zealand. And you'll see that Australia now has the highest total cancer incidence of any country in the world, which is not a position particularly to be envied. However, here's the good news. That was in men. This is in men too. This is total cancer mortality, and you'll see that the total cancer mortality is actually coming down. But that doesn't speak particularly to the prevention of cancer. This speaks more to something about early detection. It speaks to the decline in lung cancer as a killer, and it speaks to improvements to some extent in the treatment of cancer. This is what's happening in women. Again, Australia is right up there with high risks of cancer, and you can see that they're not headed down in any way at the moment, but you'll see that the mortality, similar to the men, is declining, but lung cancer is not contributing to the decline in cancer in women yet. We hope we'll see that before too long. So I'm going to walk you through a series of risk factors that we know about for cancer. I'm not going to give you a lot of the data, but we can talk about it as we go along, the direct evidence for the linking of these as prevention agents. But I'm going to walk you through what we know, and I'm going to then talk about how well, with each one of them, how well we're doing in Australia. So one of the things is, and I'll start here, physical activity reduces the risk of several cancers, particularly colon, but quite a number as well as obesity, heart disease, diabetes, etc. So an important consideration is physical activity, so we might want to know how we're doing on that. Here this actually is not a fake photograph. These are people going into their fitness center up the escalator. An interesting thought. So here we have worldwide physical inactivity, and you'll see that Australia is in that pink zone, which characterizes a lot of the developed world. And the pink zone there says somewhere between 30 and 40% of both men and women are essentially inactive. And inactive in this particular instance means less than 150 minutes a week. Now, Australia has among the lowest walk to work or walk and cycle to work of a whole lot of both comparable countries and low and middle income countries. And you'll see here about 3 to 5% actually spending time walking or cycling to work. And you can compare that with France, where it's more like 35, or even the US, where it seems to be a little higher, although in the same general range. Now, according to the Australian Health Survey from the Australian Bureau of Statistics, Adults spend an average of just over 30 minutes a day in physical activity, but according to their own classification system, only less than half met the sufficiently active threshold. And you can see here that the insufficient physical activity was associated with relative socioeconomic disadvantage, and we need to think about why, when you're already at risk of a variety of other things, there's even less incentive and less opportunity. But also, the people who you might expect to be exercising more, those with a higher body mass and smoking, which might at least set off some risks here, they're also exercising less. So you can see here, this is the decline, sufficient physical activity from age 18 to 24 up to 75 and over, and you can see there's more or less a steady decline across the age groups, such that 50 to 60% in the young people, and in the age group 75 and over, you can see it's only about 20 to 30%. So there's a considerable decline over time. And children and young people, age 5 to 17, so 90 minutes a day on physical activity and 136 minutes sitting in front of a screen. And as you will see in the next couple of slides, the screen really drives a lot of what children do. 44% of kids in this group had at least one type of screen-based item in their bedroom, and this was true for 75% of 15 to 17-year-olds, associated with spending an extra 2 hours a week with screen-based media compared with those without a screen. And you'll see what this does to physical activity. It simply declines across the ages in the same way that we saw for the other population, for the older population. You'll see that, again, you're seeing a decline with age. But this is just among children. So the general levels of activity in Australia are rather more modest than we would like them to be. And it's an interesting question, and we'll come back to it. What is it that will change some of those things? How can we think about that? And I hope we can have a bit of a discussion at the end. So let me shift to thinking about body mass. And this is a quote that says, in primitive times, lack of food gave languishing bodies to death. Now, on the other hand, it's abundance that buries them. This is actually a quote from Lucretius in 50 BC. So you might think, well, hang on, you know, nothing's changed, but actually some things have. So we do know that maintaining a body weight throughout life and not getting fatter as you get older, and particularly getting past 50, really matters in relation to risk of cancer. This is what's happening worldwide in body mass trends, and you can see that they're going up at 0.4 kilograms per meter squared, so that's a substantial increase over every decade. And you can see the average BMI, which is recommended to be between 20 and 25, and you can see that the average BMI is now hitting right up, getting close to being out of the range which we regard as normal, and that's average, and that's right across the world. And the same thing, you can see similar sorts of patterns among the women worldwide. And then if we look specifically at Australia, Australasia is this one here, and now we're not going up, this is meant, we're going up 0.9 kilograms per meter squared, and you can see that men in Australia, the average is already out of the range that we regard as adequate. And again, with women, you see the same sort of thing, where this is now 1.2 kilograms per meter squared. So these are big increases over time. It gives you a slope that's going up in ways that you don't want, and it ends up with a high proportion of people who are at risk for a variety of disorders because of their increasing body weight. And this is a projection from Walls and Company showing that the overweight group, so the overweight group is those who have a body mass index of 25 to 30, that's probably going to stay flat on the basis of current prediction, but the obese, that is the over 30, will rise to be almost the same number, and you'll see that the proportion of normal weight folks is actually going to drop below 30% on current trends by 2025. These are not trends that we would like to see actually happen. It's tied with physical activity, it's tied with nutrition. It would be nice to see some turnaround in this. Here's a slight turnaround. The proportion of, this is overweight and trends and obese trends in boys and girls, and you'll see that there seems to be a flattening in Australia between the end of the 90s and up to the current time. Both in boys and girls, there seems to be a flattening of the rise, but that doesn't mean the proportion's changing, it just means the rate of change has slowed. It isn't just a problem in the high-income countries. Here's what's happening in trends in overweight and obesity in Chinese children, and you'll see here that the overweight and the obese represented 4%, 2 and a bit percent in 1991, and now more than double that by 2006, and it's still going up in China. And we're beginning to see the consequences of that in relation to their risk of specific diseases. This is a paper we published in New England Journal in 2011, and basically what you see is that this is East Asia. I'll come to the Indians and Bangladeshis in a minute. This is in East Asia, and what you'll see is that not only is there a risk with increasing body weight for dying of cancer, cardiovascular disease, and other causes, mostly infectious diseases, but other things as well. But this is the one set of populations you can actually see what's going on among the underweight, and you'll see that that's a risk as well, particularly in East Asians. Less of an issue, and intriguingly, is this, although the confidence bars are very wide in the upper end of this for the Indians and Bangladeshis, but at the moment we haven't got a full explanation for this, but we suspect it's because the overweight Indians and Bangladeshis are the rich ones, and they're able to buy their statins and buy their treatments for their diseases, and I suspect that we will end up seeing that rise in India in the same sort of way that we've already seen in China. So, as a sort of summary, but this was written by John Powles and colleagues in 1993, that factors favoring longevity, higher physical activity, a normal body mass, and high intakes of intact plant food. So let's look at that. We know that a diet, I would tell you, know that a diet high in vegetables and fruit is associated with a reduced risk of cancer. And we've kind of known about this for a long time. These were two papers that were published in the UK in 1933, drawing attention to the fact that oral cancer in India was lower amongst those who had a higher veg and fruit intake. And Stocks and Kahn showed that cancer in the UK was also associated with eating more fruit and vegetables. We summarized all that was known in the early 90s, and these papers have been highly cited, but obviously nobody acts on it, so it's interesting. But these are summaries of the epidemiology and then the mechanisms, which we published in 91. And then in 1997, we published this report, Food, Nutrition and the Prevention of Cancer, a Global Perspective. And in that report, we made this recommendation that for a public health goal, promote year-round consumption of a variety of vegetables, providing 7% or more of energy, and then 400 to 800 grams or 5 or more portions a day for a variety of vegetables and fruit all year round. We put the 15 to 30 ounces because Americans don't know what grams are. Now, some of our ancestors have been interested in consuming plant foods for quite some time, but Australians, more of a problem than we think. So this is what's happening with vegetables. So there is an increase in potato consumption, but other vegetables are flat, pretty flat consumption. This is from Espinel and Inez Hughes, and you'll see that the rates here are rising for potato consumption, actually to more than 60 kilograms a year. Here, the rates are pretty flat. The consumption's pretty flat. The total intake, if you want to put it in grams a day, it's about 190 grams a day of potatoes and about 110 grams a day for the rest. So about 300 grams, that's less than we were recommending, and it stayed pretty flat. And then fruit is similarly fairly flat for most fruit, although it's going up, the other fresh fruit, and it's particularly gone up for citrus consumption in Australia. Total consumption here is about 275 grams a day. So again, not as high as we would like. And then this is in vegetables in 5 to 16-year-olds, and you can see that it's not a very enthusiastic consumption level here. And fruit, apart from juice, is also not all that enthusiastically absorbed by our young folks either. Older people, a little more, although there's no trend here. The consumptions are up for both fruit and vegetables among both men and women, but it's modest, you can see. So your mother was right, eat your vegetables. We know that a diet high in meat and sugar is associated with an excess risk, or you can state it the way I've just done here. This is what's been happening to meat consumption in Australia. Actually, beef and veal has undergone quite a decline, but others have been going up, and Australians are now consuming about 120 kilograms per year of meat, which is about 330 grams of meat a day overall. And amongst older people, over 50, again, there's no trend here, but that's a slightly lower consumption, or it's a lower consumption somewhat than the population as a whole, which tells you there's very high consumption at other parts. And here's what's happening with sugar. Sugar consumption's come down a little, but it's still at about 140 grams a day. And part of this is explained by the fact that although people are actually using less sugar as refined sugar, the amount of sugar that's available in manufactured foods has been steadily climbing. It's flattened off a little by the end of the 90s. But so here's what's happening with energy and sugar in men and women over 50. And you'll see that both energy is going up and sugar is actually going up, well, in women. It's about the same proportion, but total energy and sugar are both going up in women, whereas in men, the energy level is actually, energy intake's actually coming down, sugar's remaining fairly flat. So that, again, there's not much shift in any of this in good directions. So you can try this one as to 1 apple every 8 hours will keep 3 doctors away. Tobacco. Tobacco is giving us a better story for Australia, particularly among men, because we know that tobacco causes a major increase in a whole slew of diseases, and I'll show you the impact in a minute. This kind of characterizes what I think about tobacco, but this is an important graph, and it comes from Banks, and it's quite recent, and it shows the cumulative risks of death from age 45 to 70 in smokers and non-smokers. And what these two graphs are showing you in both men and women is that men are dying about, and women are dying about 10 years younger. The smokers, so there's about 10 years of life associated with smoking. That ought to be an incentive to change habits, but for some people it's really hard. However, this is the good news. This is what smoking tobacco actually looks like in Australia now, where the men are down. Prevalence of smoking in adults is less than 20% of men and less than 15% of women. And we're almost down to hardcore serious addicts by the time you get into this realm. Very hard for some people to give up smoking, and this is good news, but the last 15 to 20% is going to be hard work, mostly for those people, and we need to think about that. Val Beryl, who's at the University of Oxford, who's an Australian epidemiologist who's been there forever, set up the Million Women study and has recently published a paper on the impact of smoking on women. A lot of the early data came from studies of men. This is smoking in relation to women. And what she shows very nicely is that amount smoked really matters, and the risk goes up from 0 smoke to 20 cigarettes. And you can see here, and this is risk of dying. So it's about a 4-fold excess mortality as a result of being a heavy smoker. The age in which you start matters. The later you start, the lower the risk. And then the age at which you stop really matters too. The earlier you stop smoking, if you've taken it up, the greater the impact on your subsequent risk. Now, this is what's happening to lung cancer incidence and mortality in Australia, and this is particularly important because what you'll see is that the incidence and mortality is coming down quite markedly in men here, but it's still, incidence is still climbing in women, and mortality maybe approximately flat, but smoking is still a big burden for women because there's this, they took up smoking much later than men, and they started to give up much later than men. All the anti-smoking stuff was directed initially at men. See, this is important, but we need more effort spent still on not only on increasing the likelihood that women will give up and not take it up, but also in working with people who've been smokers to get ahead of the causes of mortality that they will face. I'm not sure why Van Gogh actually had such a prescient notion, but somehow or other he captured this in a way that all those lurid things on cigarette packets, this looks as good as any of them. Australia's actually been really good with smoking prevention. One of the earliest sets of programs that went on in Australia. Australia was the first to introduce plain packaging. These particular, I won't show them because I presume you've all seen them, but it's been copied in a lot of places, moving towards plain packaging, moving towards lurid photographs and warnings about the dangers of smoking. So let me touch on alcohol. A lower intake of alcoholic drinks is associated with a decreased risk of several cancers, particularly has an impact on breast cancer in women and on bowel cancer and head and neck cancer. So it's an important contributor to cancer risk. And there's a slight tension in the messages that we get because people say, yes, but it's good for your heart. It's true, it's good for your heart at very, very low levels. As soon as you're above a tiny level, actually your risk of hypertension and a bunch of other things start to climb, which everyone conveniently forgets. Shouldn't drink alcohol on the basis that if some's good, more's better, because it isn't true. One of the things that's been happening in Australia is there's been a gradual increase in the alcohol content and the market share of wine. And alcohol intake is now being underestimated by quite a number of official statistics. It's now at the highest point since the early 90s, and we are seeing alcohol-related harm pretty widespread. And these particular authors argue for a timely and accurate data on alcohol sales. This is the comparison they draw, that yes, alcohol looks like it's fairly steady at a pretty high level, but looks like it's fairly steady on the old assumptions. But if you figure the assumptions appropriately, alcohol consumption has been steadily climbing for Australians over the last 20 years. What's this telling us? Let me pause for a minute and let you think about this. But a lot of the things that we're talking about are rare in nature. Sugar is rare, salt is rare, fat is rare, meat is rare, alcohol is rare, as are some of our favorite human drugs, recreational ones. And we have a taste for all of these things. And because they're rare in nature, and because for quite a number of them you had to work fairly hard to get them, there were no deleterious consequences to consumption because consumption was pretty modest. We've not evolved natural curbs on overconsumption. Shakespeare knew a little about this. Our response to their rarity, once we'd established that we didn't have to hunt and gather, was to cultivate them to keep ourselves in calories and in comfort. And our commitment to this has led us to more and more intensity in the way we raise our food and drugs. And this is the problem of monoculture. That's a topic for another time. But I want to draw your attention to this rarity because it then begins, even in our recent history, rarity is obvious. Throughout human history, we consumed modest amounts of most of these things. For instance, here's meat consumption in traditional agricultural societies, rarely higher than 5 to 10 kilograms a year. And then meat was usually a celebratory overconsumption, occasionally. And then per capita sugar consumption in the UK was about 1700, around 1700, was less than 2 kilograms a year. Contrast that, and I'll remind you of the data that I just showed you before, meat consumption in Australia, also US, New Zealand, whatever, now around 120 kilograms a year. So that's about a 12 to 24-fold increase. And as a comparison, India's consumption's around 3 kilograms, so it's back in the pre-industrial levels. And per capita sugar consumption in Australia already by 1990 was about 40 kilograms a year, and we've just seen that it's similar. So this is again a 20 to 25-fold increase in consumption. These are big changes against a biology that is fairly consistent over the last few hundred years, not to say the last few thousand years. So perhaps we could work on this. Might be a useful label. We know that avoiding excessive sun exposure reduces the risk of melanoma and other skin cancers, but in fact, melanoma incidence is still climbing in men and probably in women. Mortality is quite low, but higher than you would like it to be. This is partly due to the awareness of this both among the general population, and so there's earlier detection, so it's less likely to kill than it used to be. But the incidence is still climbing, which suggests that something's not getting through. Now, this is non-melanoma cancer, and you'll see here the rate of, the incidence rates are pretty much flat, which is not what you'd like to see. And the mortality in men's coming down, not sure about women, it looks pretty flat. Non-melanoma skin cancers are normally not particularly lethal, but clearly squamous cell carcinoma does kill. And clearly we're getting somewhere with perhaps early detection, but we're not necessarily getting anywhere, particularly with prevention. An important contribution to lower risks of cancer is screening and early detection. This is lower risks of dying from cancer. A number of screening programs actually allow us to detect the cancers early, although there are ways of detecting precancerous lesions for bowel cancer, but not widely used in Australia. This is what's happening with screening. Nearly 6 in 10 women are following the recommendations for pap smears. Nearly 6 in 10 are doing similarly for breast cancer screening, for mammograms. And around, however, 4 in 10 Aboriginal and Torres Strait Island women had a mammogram. So we're seeing, again, some distinction by social class, by access, and by ethnicity to some of these questions. Now, this is what's actually happening to bowel cancer. If you think about screening, you might see that there, Australia is actually pretty flat in relation to incidence. Compare that with the USA. That's the purple one. So this is the USA, where colonoscopic screening has been instituted for a while now, and this is actually having some impact on incidence. Why is that true? Well, if you're using colonoscopic screening, you're actually detecting the precancerous lesions, not just the cancer lesions. And so you actually remove the precancer, and that never becomes a cancer. So you actually see a decline in incidence, which is not what you see, for instance, with breast cancer, where you get an early breast cancer and you detect it, but it's still a cancer. But you can see here that Australia's incidence for bowel cancer is pretty flat. So, and that's largely because of the way in which we screen. Nonetheless, you have to weigh up the balance between screening cost, availability of expertise, staffing power, etc. It's a real issue to think about and think through. So that was in women. This is in men. It's a similar pattern. You'll see here. Some of you have noticed the fact that you're actually seeing a decline in New Zealand, and I honestly can't tell you what that's due to. I don't understand quite why the incidence is declining in New Zealand. Because New Zealand does not have a screening program. I'm involved at the moment in the early stages of introducing a pilot scheme to begin to put in place the kind of program that exists in Australia. It doesn't exist yet, and so I'm really unclear on what's going on with that particular observation. What is good news in Australia is that although the incidence is fairly flat, the mortality is coming down, and again, this is going to be awareness of symptoms, presenting earlier, being treated earlier, and being treated better. So there are some changes that we are seeing, so awareness really matters. This is the proportion of individuals who are actually seeking screening in Australia for bowel cancer, with participation by age and sex, and you can see that women, as usual, are better at this than men are, but also that older folks are better than younger, but this is still less than half the population. Now, Australia has amongst the highest rates of breast cancer in the world. You can see here that this is the scale here, and the deep blue. Australia is a deep blue along with North America and parts of Western Europe. Similar levels in New Zealand. And you'll see here that breast cancer trends in Australia. This is incidence. You can see that's been steadily climbing. It may have flattened here. I certainly hope that the screening is beginning to bite. But even so, that ought not, except the fact that screening can pick up some early precancerous lesions. So there may be something going on. Again, it's not clear, but again, Australia is amongst the highest rates in the world. And this is remoteness from major cities outwards, right? And this actually impacts on the likelihood that a woman will get screened. So again, that's something that ought to be thought about. Here's what's happening with over the last 20 years in breast cancer incidence and mortality, and you can see that mortality is coming down. That is certainly due in part to early detection, but you can see that incidence isn't changing very much at all. Then here's some good news. This is cervix cancer incidence in a variety of places, and you can see here that the developed world countries that we're looking at, that I put up in this set of slides, are all got pretty low rates, and Australia's got a very low rate of cervix cancer, which speaks to a number of issues about exposure to a virus causing cancer. It speaks also to involvement in the National Cervical Screening Program. Again, there's some difference by remoteness, but here a lot more evenness of uptake of pap smears, which is good. And what you see here is that incidence and mortality, as I already showed you, is pretty low, and it's still declining at least until the early part of the 21st century. And incidence has come down, and I think we don't fully understand exactly what's going on, but there's a whole lot of socioeconomic indicators and a variety of other things that are important in cervix cancer incidence. But here's something else that's important, and I think many of you will know this. Some cancers are caused by viruses, and vaccination is effective in reducing risk. And Australia, again, has been very important and very early in getting the human papillomavirus vaccine out into the community, and focusing not only in vaccinating young women, but also young men, which improves herd immunity, as well as lowering their risk of some subsequent cancers. But there's a paper published in Lancet Infectious Diseases showing a substantial fall in vaccine-targeted, the human papillomaviruses types that are particularly focused, particularly the focus of the vaccine. They're falling in vaccinated women. There's a lower prevalence of vaccine-targeted types in the unvaccinated women, which already suggests that there's something going on with herd immunity. And there's even possible indication of cross-protection against other HPV types. So this has been quite a success story, and you'll see here, this is the pre-vaccine and post-vaccine prevalences of just simply carrying the viruses. And you'll see that they have come down, anyone, and then the high-risk types, and then the high-risk types that exclude the ones that are most 16 and 18, which are most important in the first vaccine. There is going to be a quadrivalent vaccine available at some point. Don't think it's available yet in Australia, but I'm not sure. But you can see that there's definite impacts on this. So going back to this slide where we were seeing the decline in incidence and mortality, you can imagine that this ought to have an impact of pushing this very, very low indeed. And just to demonstrate that vaccines can have a benefit in other cancers as well, liver cancer is not much of a problem in Australia, although it does exist, and most of it in Australia is due to hepatitis C, not hepatitis B. But Taiwan was the place that introduced the most effective hepatitis B and launched it early. This was a hepatitis B vaccination program that was launched in the 80s. And there's now something like 80 to 90% protection amongst infants born to women who were themselves HBV positive. So that's how it's transmitted. It's vertically transmitted from mother to infant, and so there's a huge impact on what's happening in children, and there's been a steady increase in the protection, so that it's around 80% more effectiveness in seroprevalence of this antigen. There's been a 70% decline in mortality from fulminant hepatitis, which is one of the killers for infection at a young age, and there's been a 75% decrease in the incidence of liver cancer in young children. So this has been a hugely successful program too, and I just raise it because it echoes what we might begin to see with the success of the cervix cancer vaccination. Okay. A mad dash through a whole series of exposures that we're responsible for ourselves, if you like, or at least that are largely dependent on individual action, and then some things that we've introduced as a community or a society or as a nation. And I want to draw your attention to that distinction, because cancer prevention activities that are supported by policies and programs implemented across communities with the informed advice and consent of those communities seem to be, on the basis of the evidence I think I've just walked you through, more successful than recommendations that rely just on individual action. There's another wrinkle. Where a cancer-causing exposure entails profit for a powerful few, tobacco, alcohol, sugar, all need to be thought of here. Community-wide action needs to be prolonged, incredibly well funded, and underpinned by specific policies that implement both carrots and sticks. We've done that with tobacco. We haven't even thought about it. For sugar, we're kind of probing at it for alcohol. But in fact, what's happened with the price of alcohol has come down, the real price, and opportunities for consumption have gone up. And so we've normed alcohol consumption as a society. In fact, most societies have normed alcohol consumption. And it's really a problem, and we need to start thinking about doing something about it. So let's open this up a little wider. What's going on widely in the world? Well, we've got an increasing population, we've got an aging population, and in many places we're seeing increases in cancer incidence. We're seeing increasing urbanization, we're seeing changes in agriculture and trade and the food supply. And in the developing world, in the low and middle income countries, the developed world cancers are being added to existing cancers and endemic deficiency and infectious diseases. So some of those places are now suffering a double whammy. Whereas we've seen a decline in stomach cancer, we've seen a decline in cervix cancer. Stomach cancer is due largely to a bacterium that lives in the stomach, the Helicobacter pylori. That's declining rapidly all over the world, but there are still high burdens in a number of places. And what's happening is we're getting increasing burdens of these high-income country diseases over and above before we've seen the decline associated with various demographic transitions. In 2012, there were 14 million new cancer cases and 8 million cancer deaths. And about, this is worldwide, and about more than 30 million people living with cancer. But look at the proportions that are going on in low and middle income countries. 8 million of those people are living in low and middle income countries for the new cases. More than half of the deaths, and less than half of those living with cancer. So that tells you about the difference between the effectiveness of treatment and early detection and prevention in low and middle income countries compared with the developed world. These gaps are likely to get wider and worse. And just because I wanted to echo back to some things that we can do ourselves, worldwide low intake of fruits and vegetables is estimated to cause about almost 20% of gastrointestinal cancer, 30% of coronary heart disease, and about 11% of stroke. And then of the global burden attributed to low fruit and vegetables, and about 85% of that's in cardiovascular diseases. So fruit and vegetables are not only good for cancers, they're really, really good for cardiovascular disease. And it's an important consideration, and we need to think about how we can do things in our own lives and in forming others. If we've got 14 million new cases and we've got 8 million cancer deaths, I can tell you that 30 to 40% is preventable by dietary change. And that's a similar impact to that seen with tobacco. The cost of treatment argues strongly for long-term investment in prevention. The problem is, of course, there's a long lag. We've seen it with tobacco. It takes a long time for these things to actually work their way through the population. And in individuals, giving up doesn't immediately turn their risk off. Risk declines over time. But it's really important, if you want to think about it, to actually influence global trends and these changes that we're talking about. Preservation of appropriate dietary practices where they still exist, adopting appropriate dietary changes prior to disease, and then a series of national policies on some of these things. And actually thinking these through, again, might be a really useful place to start a dialogue. But if you want to think about it as an individual, adopt or develop a cuisine and a way of life, not a set of rules. It's really useful. There are plenty of good cuisines out there that could be brought into your lives. Gradual change for many, but some people like radical change, and that's okay. But really important, education is not enough. And we don't acquire these things overnight, and we've stopped teaching children, by and large, about how to choose food, how to prepare food. We've got to practice. We need family support to reintroduce. I mean, in the US, it's intriguing to me, but I don't think this has happened in Australia, but you can buy apartments in many cities in the US now where there are no kitchens in those apartments, and because people just eat out everything. And that's a problem because it gives you very, very little control over what you're consuming. But we need to learn about tasting. Children especially need to learn about tasting food. Children will reject stuff that they never tasted before. So with adults, but they might be marginally more rational about it. It takes about 15 tries before you really know whether you like something or not. The French have a really good program to get kids to think about food. And that's what they train them with. They spend time thinking about what the taste of food is, and we don't have a language for it, and so we usually just say, yeah, I don't like that, and then we stop and not think through why we don't like it, what does it taste like, etc. So trial and error, and that means you need household support, you know, for the mistakes that you make. You need feedback. And then finally, to go to some particularly wide topics, what about the impact on land and water use? Well, these are data from Colin Spedding, number of people supportable by a production from 1 hectare of land. So if you're raising animal foods, you can see here that you can support about 1 to 3 people on a hectare of land. If you're raising plant foods, whether it's vegetables or it's grains, your numbers go up quite a lot. So we need to think about that use, that particular use. And then one further thought about this, and that is how much water does it take to raise a kilogram of food? Well, if you're raising potatoes, it's about 500 litres. But if you're raising a kilogram of beef, it's about 100,000 litres of water, at least if you raise it in the American tradition. It's less obvious if you've got free-range stuff. If we're going to feed the world in 2050, food production is going to need to double. We're going to have a 30% larger population. We're probably going to have a wealthier population, though sometimes we might doubt that. More urbanized and more desirous of eating red meat. But here's one of the really important things that's happening about food this is crop diversity. 93% of commercial crops that were available in 1903 of seed types have gone extinct in the United States. And you can see it doesn't really matter. You can look at this as beets and cabbage and sweet corn and so on. But you can see that the actual number of commercial varieties available for sale has diminished spectacularly. And then one other impact on our capacity to feed the world is rising global food prices. And you can see that there was a spike in the 70s, and then there were 2 spikes in 2008, 2011. At the moment, the FAO Food Price Index is actually quite a long way down. But we're only one series of bad seasons across the world from another spike in food prices and the increasing risks. And it's due to all of these things: population pressure, fuel and fertilizer costs, soil degradation, water shortages, speculation, hoarding, biofuels, and regional climate change. These data, these comments come from Tony McMichael. And it was Tony who gave me this slide as well. Although there's still a great deal to learn about the causes and prevention of cancer, we have not yet put into practice an awful lot that we know, both as communities and as individuals. But if you want to end up on a slightly more upbeat note, the secret of a long and happy life is to remain inedible. Thank you very much. I'm happy to take questions, and I hope we'll have a conversation about some of these issues. I thank you very much for your attention, and I'm very pleased again, Rachel, to have been invited to deliver this lecture. Thank you all.